One example of slavery from 600 BCE to 600 CE is in the early Mayan civilization. Slavery was an integral part of the Mayan civilization, not just in the labor force, but also in the religious practices. This photo here shows the ritualistic cutting out of a slave's heart while he was still alive. The heart was then an offering to the gods. Mayan slaves were also used as an integral part of the agricultural system depicted here. As you can see, slaves were the foundation upon which the Mayan civilization was built. One of the many examples of slavery from 600 CE to 1450 CE is the Abbasid Caliphate's use of Mamluks. Mamluks were Turkish slaves that were well trained as soldiers. The Mamluks became an integral part of both the Abbasid army and armies of many other Islamic kingdoms. Eventually, these slaves went on to found their own dynasties in the area, including in Syria and Egypt, which they ruled for several hundred years. Today, the Mamluks are more remembered for their time as sultans than their time as slaves, but as Amir of Benison speaks to, they never left their pasts behind.
And in fact, the word Mamluk means a person possessed or an item possessed, so it indicates their servile origin.
These slaves were used by the Abbasid Caliphate up until the dynasty fell in 945. One example of slavery from 1450 to 1750 CE was in the Spanish colonies in the New World. The Spanish used both the encomienda and the mitas system of forced labor. They forced the Amerindians to work for them both in their silver mines and agriculturally. This system of slavery is what made these colonies profitable for the Spanish. Eventually, the Spaniards would shift away from the Amerindian slaves and instead import more and more African slaves. As you can see here, the Spanish built their colonies on the foundation of slavery, just like so many did who came both before and after the Spanish conquistadors. The brutal slavery in the Congo Free State, the Belgian colony in Africa, is only one of the many examples of slavery from 1750 to 1900 CE. These drawings and photos show the harsh reality that was life on the rubber plantations in the Congo Free State. Congolese villagers were forced to meet incredibly high production quotas, and if they didn't meet these quotas, the slaves faced brutal punishments in the form of extreme whippings, having their hands cut off, or massacres of entire villages. But without the cruel and deadly slavery on the rubber plantations, the Congo Free State would have never turned a profit for the Belgians. In October of 2013, the Global Slavery Index was published. They estimated that roughly 29.8 million people remain enslaved today, with the highest prevalence being in Mauritania and the highest actual numbers in India. The expansion of the Roman Empire was one of the primary military conflicts between 600 BCE and 600 CE. In their campaign to create the vast empire depicted here, the Roman Empire encountered and conquered many different kinds of people, resulting in a great amount of cultural diffusion. This diffusion occurred religiously, intellectually, technologically, and in many other ways. The Crusades was one of the primary military conflicts between 600 and 1450 CE. The Crusades were ostensibly for religious reasons, the Christian world attempting to reclaim their homeland from the Muslims. The Crusades is just one of many of the clashes between these two cultures, and fighting was their primary and sometimes only form of interaction for many centuries. The conquest and consequent colonization of Latin America was one of the major military conflicts between 1450 and 1750 CE. The primary combatants were the Spanish and the Portuguese versus the Amerindian peoples, including the Aztec and the Inca empires. This fighting led not only to the death of tens of thousands, this led also to the spread of Christianity and other European ideologies coming in and either taking over or blending with the native practice. The scramble for Africa after the Berlin Conference is one of the defining features of the period from 1750 to 1900 CE. The scramble for Africa is what occurred after the European nations had already decided amongst themselves the division of the continent. The only thing left to do was to inform the African people of who their new rulers were. But most of the Europeans soon discovered that their colonies were not ready to go down without a fight. This led to a multitude of unequal fights between the African kingdoms and the European powers. The military conflict and other interactions of cultures that resulted from the scramble for Africa are one of the major defining features of the time period. The U.S. war in Afghanistan has spanned almost 13 years, ever since the September 11th attack on the World Trade Center, but it's now coming to a close. As of February 25, 2014, President Barack Obama has announced that if the Afghani president does not sign the BSA agreement, all U.S. troops will pull out of Afghanistan by the end of this year. (600 BCE to 600 CE was a time of almost universal absolute male control. For example, women in Han China had no control of their lives, and according to Confucius, had to first submit to their father, then their husband, and finally their sons. In Greece, women were married as teenagers to husbands as much as 2 or even 3 times their age, and had neither political rights nor an education. In ancient Rome, women were seen as children in the eyes of the law for their entire lives. Although women were still seen as subservient to men from 600 to 1450 CE, they enjoyed increased political rights and freedom, especially in the Islamic world. As demonstrated by the chess game depicted here, women had more educational rights in the Islamic kingdom than ever before. Women could also now inherit property under Islamic law. From 1450 to 1750 CE, women had an increase in societal presence and right to an education, especially in Europe. During this time, England had 2 female queens, Elizabeth I and Mary I. This portrait is of Maria Celeste Galilei, the daughter of Galileo. She was one of the women during this time period who had access to a previously unimaginable level of education. The Industrial Revolution affected an incredible amount of social change between 1750 and 1900 CE. For women, it both caused an increase in jobs that were available to them and, ironically, sharply defined the domestic sphere. Additionally, as those jobs became more well-paid, they were allocated to the men, and women increasingly had to stay home and care for the children. In early February of 2014, the United Nations released a report saying that, quote, progress had been unequal and fragmented. The report is about the state of women all over the world today. It looks at women's literacy, job prospects, and healthcare. And while a lot of progress has been made, there's still a long way to go. For example, 800 women still die every day in childbirth. While the names and faces change, the way that cultures interact and develop remains incredibly consistent throughout history.